with all of these protests and everything going on, there's been lots of calls for the removal of statues. There's, even in Minnesota, some protesters did take down the statue of Christopher Columbus. And
right.
So I think one of my first questions is why, this might sound crazy, but why do we even have them? Why do we have statues of people up?
Well, it's a great question. The thing is that, these are such interesting questions, as they're very much a thing of the past, particularly classical styled monuments where it's a figure on a pedestal. The equestrian statue, the man on a horse, was really the calling card for the late 19th, early 20th century. There's this period where people are crazy for monuments, where this was, it was a period that people in the time, contemporaries at the time, called monument mania, because people were sort of criticizing this as, why do we have so many monuments? Why is everybody so crazy to put these up everywhere in center, in front of government buildings, in city squares? And they started to get to the point where people thought, well, these aren't as effectual in what they were supposed to do. And so the question is, what were they supposed to do? And you're still asking this question, is why did they have them? But in the late 19th, early 20th century, places all over the world were doing this. Europe, Latin America, the US, putting up statues of people that were supposed to represent our values. They were ideas. During Monument Mania, why were they all doing this? People were rushing to put up monuments to national heroes or ideals. Because in the 19th century, you see a lot of places that are going through turmoil. The US is one, the Civil War. In Europe, for example, the French Revolution in the late 18th century, of course, explodes, and then there's a long period of revolutionaries trying to figure out how to define the country. So monuments were understood in the in this period where we see the Columbus statues. A lot of those come in the early 20th century. Same with Confederate monuments. Monuments were understood, very clearly understood, as a way to project values in public spaces. They were about giving examples literally on a pedestal, right? So you look up at it and the viewer is sort of separated from this deified figure above. And this is a figure that represents patriotism, virtue, valor, all of those things. And so you see a big push towards this exaltation of the individual. The individual represents us. Calls that they're erasing history. Most monuments created in this period, they're not about history. They're about creating a vision of the past and of the future. And so there's also this idea that, this firm belief that citizens in these new republics needed to see those examples in their everyday landscapes. This is the example that you want to live up to. And so the questions that we're looking at now is, are Confederates something that we as a nation, does it represent our values as a nation, or Columbus?
Sure.
So.
And I like that you had brought up the argument that we're seeing over and over again, that us taking down these statues that were erasing history, but that's not what they were even meant for.
Right, is that the truth is that most monuments, particularly in this period that you see, late 19th, early 20th century, right up into the mid 20th century, the idea of these was not about the past, it was about a vision for the future. And so for Confederate monuments, those in particular were a vision of white supremacy, of continuing what the Confederate cause was, which cannot be divorced from continuing slavery. The lost cause narrative, as it's known, is what these monuments projected, is that, that there was valor in the Confederacy, and it wasn't about slavery. It was about, protecting Southern heritage against a Northern aggressor. And so Confederate monuments in particular, it's really interesting, and you look at this from a global perspective, because you can see what was France trying to say, what was England trying to say, and there's people all over in countries everywhere that are saying, this is crazy. Why do we have so many monuments? Why are so everybody obsessed with this? Because it was seen as a clear way to project values and define identity.
Okay.
And so what do Confederate monuments tell us about the identity that what was that? It's not about the history, actually. It's about a vision for the future and who, a white supremacist vision in this case.
Sure. And would there be an argument at all that, since that was such a, part of the South that is taking these down kind of, might hurt their identity. The South just has such that identity, and
Right.
they pride themselves for that.
Well, because the lost cause, in so many senses, it worked, right? Is that, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, beginning in the early 1900s, or actually even in the late 1800s, I should say, most Confederate monuments go up from 1890 to even up to 1950. And so there's a concerted effort to rewrite the Civil War into this lost cause narrative, is that after the Civil War, Southerners are devastated. They lose the war, they lose what they see as their way of life. Their way of life includes chattel slavery. There's really, the lost cause really is powerful. It carries a lot of weight. It is tied to identity, right? And this was part of was what it was intended to do, is to divorce the issue of slavery from the Civil War and sort of make it about a vague idea of Southern heritage. The thing is that monuments are a really flawed way to understand history. It's a very minimal venue. It doesn't tell a complex story. History is complex, people are complex. And so the monument really only tells this celebratory narrative. It's very important for us to remember history. Southerners can certainly remember their past. We can remember it too. It's important that we do, but we don't have to venerate it. And so the monument is about commemorating it, venerating a past that, again, like I said before, monuments are so much more about values than they are about history.
They have a vested interest in not allowing us to learn about things like Juneteenth or the Black Codes, or Jim Crow and how Jim Crow actually operated, or restrictive covenants here in Eau Claire.
And so what were those covenants that you talked about in Eau Claire?
Restrictive covenants. We had, and you can go to the Chippewa Valley Museum and take a look at a couple of them. There were covenants in, especially the Third Ward, house deeds that said they could not be sold to anyone who was Native American, Black, or of other racial statuses than white. And that is from a time when Germans were not seen as white. So it was meant to keep German immigrants, Blacks, and Indians out of those neighborhoods. But yeah, here in Eau Claire, the reason why you can buy alcohol 24 hours at that Walgreens in Altoona, and you can't here on the Eau Claire side, that's a blue law that was aimed at German immigrants to try to force them to be sober or to stop drinking at a certain time, 9 o'clock, on Saturday night, to force them to go to church the next morning.
Looking at what's happening right now in the world, do you kind of see that this is, I don't want to compare it to the 60s, but do you feel like it's kind of in the same vein, like things are moving, things are changing now?
I think they're moving and they're changing. I mean, it feels like 1965. Okay. When white supremacist violence and the videos that we're seeing have forced people to begin to reckon with the issue. But the problem is we're also seeing those who don't like change rear up. It's ironic because when you engage with them, they can't literally see it. You point to it on the video, and they say, well, I don't see that.
The protests that have been going on, it's been 4 weeks, or a month now, that they have been going on, and it's been going on globally. And looking back at other protests, with Ferguson, with Michael Brown, that lasted for the month of August, and things, then, picked back up again during the trial and all of that with that officer. But these seem to be really sparking more protests for longer periods of time. So do you think that that's going to help shift the system?
I think that the Arbery, Taylor, and Floyd murders with the video has begun to shift the narrative. It's forced some people, like white evangelicals, are being forced to engage the issue and not just dismiss it. You can't dismiss that video in the same way. And I think the sustained power of these and the fact that they're worldwide tells us something about the corruption of government that we need to address. People in the Chippewa Valley, people here in Eau Claire, do not understand how lucky they are. We have a professionalized police force here. They think every police force is like the one in Eau Claire. We have an exceptional set of people who are leaders, who do training, who really lead the state. We do better training and more of it, and I say that as a police and fire commission, than Milwaukee or Madison does. We do better. Now my question is, how does Milwaukee get away with that?
I just wanted to ask you, because I've seen just with conversations with people and just overhearing things on Facebook, all of that kind of stuff, people have talked about the protests and they're always wondering why the interstates and why the highways, why would they do that? Why do they want to block that?
What you have to understand is for a protest to be effective, it needs to do two things. It has to force people who don't usually deal with the issue to engage it. And it has to undermine, it has to cause a price for racism. The highway protests are the new sit-ins. And the highways are always very careful. If you notice, they're the ones that went through the black community and destroyed the black businesses there. These are the people who drive right by and they never have to engage it. The highway protests force them to engage it.
You think that right now, the protests that we're seeing, you think, and the conversations now, we're sitting down, we're having this conversation, you're teaching me a lot about things that I, didn't know or haven't experienced. Is this how we're going to change the system?
We change the system one conversation at a time, one person at a time. Instead of thinking of racism, think of a racial performance. We perform race. And the way to break up that performance are these individual discussions. The way to break up that unconscious bias is meeting people, working with people, and seeing that they are not the stereotypes.
And so then what was happening in the 70s and 80s here in the 1970s and 1980s with the Ojibwa people?
So two brothers who were college students, Mike and Fred Tribble, who were LCO tribal members, they'd been in a class learning about treaties, and it occurred to them that they had rights under the treaties that had never been given up, and one of those rights was to fish and anywhere in the ceded territory. So they called the game warden, this is about 1974, they called the game warden and said, say, we're going to push our ice fishing rig off of the reservation, we're going to go fishing, so if you'd like to come out and arrest us, that'd be just fine. And so the game warden did. Came out and arrested them, and that went clear all the way to the I think it's the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals, and it was decided in the brothers' favor that they could fish anywhere in the ceded territory. So it was a long court case, and certainly a great college education, right? Mm-hmm. And then, as the years progressed, more and more cases, some of them which went all the way to the Supreme Court, and some of them came from Minnesota, some from Wisconsin, established more parameters for those treaty rights. That here's the way those treaties were signed back in the 1800s, and here's what they mean today. The state of Wisconsin, the DNR, the schools, gaslighted the white public about these laws. That's true. That's a true story. And so the people who lived then in northern Wisconsin and Minocqua and all these other places didn't understand that these were rights that the Ojibwa people always had, not rights that they were given specially by the DNR, by the state of Wisconsin. And so they were, understandably anxious about that, agitated and angry, because they thought that the Ojibwa people had rights that white people didn't have. Well, those rights they'd always had, but never given away. I think if that had been understood, it would have changed the conversation. So then there were huge protests. Protests with hundreds, thousands of people, protests that made the national news. And so angry people showing up at the boat landings with signs and posters and placards, none of which I can repeat on the air for your viewers. Really racist, ugly violent confrontations and white people throwing rocks at boats and terrorizing Ojibwe people for asserting the rights that they'd always had.
So, it spans hundreds of years for, the Native American people, for Black people in America. So looking at it from a historian's perspective, what you're seeing now in the world, do you see kind of a, that we're bound to repeat history if we don't do something about this now?
Maybe. This is long standing. This stems from perceptions and from actions and from misunderstandings which actually predate European settlement of America. So yeah, I think that's long standing, and I think that reverberates down to this very day. So whenever, of course, we see people of a different color, a different culture, we're uncomfortable anyway. I mean, that seems like a characteristic that goes out throughout world history.
With the football players, they are literally wearing the blue gold name. How does the university move forward from this?
Well, I think the important thing to understand is, we have to recognize that they were students and not just football players. So this is an educational process. So I don't want to do anything that disparages the whole football team because a few students made this lapse in judgment. Our goal is to make sure that we're setting the stage for not only accountability, but what the expectation is for anyone to be a member of the Blue Gold family. So that's looking at expanding trainings, looking at our policies, looking at our accountability metrics, making sure that when these things happen, we respond to it, we don't sweep it under the rug. But really getting everyone on a level understanding of what these incidents mean, what's the root of it, what the institution's responsibility is, what the individual responsibility is, and how we hold each other accountable for creating the environment we want here at the university.
And what you just said that, these weren't just football players, these were students. And looking just at things that we've all been seeing, there's that cancel culture now. Yeah. What do you think of that as someone who is in education, who is seeing these incidents, seeing them as students, that this is, that's a learning opportunity for them to learn that this is wrong? What do you think about this now cancel culture?
That's the easy way out. That's the easy way to do things. We're an educational environment. We understand that students come here and our goal is to teach them. Our goal is to educate them. To use the old adage, we can't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Students made a mistake, albeit big mistakes. They will be held accountable either by the university, by their respective students, both personally and things they have to internalize. But we have to understand that as an institution, this is a place where people are coming, they're growing, they're developing. Our goal is to set the stage so that they understand when something like this happens, what the impact of what it was that they did, but that it affects people differently. While a lot of people may have seen it as them just sharing a photo, what that photo represented for a lot of people was pain, heartache, and a harken back to the past. We're trying to make sure that people understand that their lapse was not representative of the culture that we're trying to create here at the university.
I mean, I can't believe it's 2020 already. We're in a very heated political year. The stakes are high, and we're also celebrating 100 years of getting the right to vote for women. Because we glance over it in the history books, I feel. We learn a little bit about it. So let's talk about the timeline of how long it took to get to that point where women were able to vote.
Well, women got the right to vote, and it wasn't given to them. They really fought for it. They fought for 72 years. From the time of a convention in New York State to 1920. In August 26th, it was when it was actually approved. So it took 3 generations of women, but men also were involved in helping with this, but not all men. Not the ones that were making the decisions.
Yes, exactly.
It's really interesting that you bring that up because it really was even at the convention you mentioned in Seneca Falls. That was in 1848. So before the Civil War, it was quite a complicated time, and there were men who were pro women's suffrage, including Frederick Douglass. A lot of the anti-slavery movement was also wrapped up with the women's rights movement as well. But there were also men and women who were also did not think that suffrage was something that women should have. And even at the convention, they were the Declaration of Sentiments and all of the things that they said that women should have. Many of the women at that convention thought that asking for the vote was a step too far. It was too much at this point, especially at that time. They said this is not going to happen. But there were a number of women who said it has to be, that's the crux. If we don't have the vote, we don't have anything.
And
So.
I can't even fathom, like I can't even think about, you were saying too before that women were also, they had to, you know, someone had to do a dance in front to vote.
And this is someone that's living today that is around 100 years old. And when she remembers going to vote, she had to do a dance in front of the men to be able to vote. I mean, and of course they laughed at it. But the fact is, it's rather intimidating.
Just a little bit.
Yeah.
And humiliating too.
Right.
You know, that it was also, you know, humiliation at the same time.
Exactly, that people had to prove or do something in order to earn the right beyond just being a citizen.
And see, some of that stuff, yeah, and some of that stuff just blows my mind because we have her here, right here, and this is a quote from her from 1921. So all of this is about, you know, 100 years old, and in the grand scheme of things, that is not a long time
Exactly.
at all. I was telling you guys that my grandmother, she was born before, you know, before the 19th Amendment was ratified. So it's just, when you put it into like that perspective, it's like, oh my goodness, she was born in a time where we did not have equal rights. Like, it wasn't that long ago.
Well, and it even is more when you think about things like even into the 1960s, there were many teachers who were not allowed to wear pants to work. That was not acceptable. That was not an acceptable uniform to wear to work, or not being able to sign for a credit card without your husband or father signing for it. That's within very recent memory.
Right.
I mean, I remember when I was in my 20s and I was going for work to rent a car, and I couldn't rent a car because I was a woman.
It's still in place, but a lot of the things that are again now coming up that are making it more difficult for people to vote, and no matter what someone's politics are, the idea that people should be able to vote and make their voices heard, and that that the vote itself should be denied. Again, we look at all of these women and men, all of the people who are fighting for this, and they dreamed of a day when we would feel like it was ridiculous,
Right.
that women couldn't vote. That what their wildest dream was that we would never conceive of that. But I think that's why it is important to also look back.
Yeah.
Because so many times we think of history and we see these stoic women kind of marching, but they were I just think of all of the protests we see today, and multi-generational, and people of different beliefs and so varied, and the passion that you see that has to carry through all the way to voting, right?
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I mean, especially with the next generation, to still, you know, keep this top of mind, that this is an important thing, that voting is an important thing, and especially now when things feel so like they could be gone. Everything just feels so at stake, no matter where your politics align. You know, this is 2020 is such an important year. And we've seen over the course of history that women, minority groups, they can really change the course of what happens.
Exactly.
You know,
Well, some of the social changes that took place after women got the right to vote can be credited to women because they wanted to see, they weren't necessarily supportive of war in the same way, but they wanted to see rights for children, rights for school, rights for social justice. So there were changes that took place as a result of the fact that women got that right to vote.